lang mehr. Wenn die Technik okay ist, legen wir los. Also, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Studierende, ich freue mich, Ihnen den Vortragenden des heutigen Abends, Professor Richard King, vorstellen zu können. Richard King studierte zunächst Philosophie und Theologie in Hull, bevor er sein Studium in Lancaster abschloss und dort 1993 in Religious Studies, Religionswissenschaft, promovierte. Er war von 1990 bis zum Jahr 2000 Lecturer, dann Leader für Religious Studies in Stirling, bevor er 2000 auf den Lehrstuhl für Religious Studies in Derby berufen wurde. 2005 ging Herr King für 5 Jahre an die Vanderbilt University in den USA, bevor er 2010 nach Glasgow, nach England, Großbritannien, Schottland zurückwechselte. 2012 bekam er einen Ruf für Buddhist and Asian Studies in Kent, wo er noch heute tätig ist. Daneben war Herr King an zahlreichen anderen Universitäten als Gastwissenschaftler, zum Beispiel in Liverpool oder Cambridge, und Mitglied des Beratergremiums für die 2009 eröffnete Guggenheim-Ausstellung The Third Mind, die den Einfluss asiatischer Kunst und Literatur auf das Kulturschaffen amerikanischer Künstler von 1860 bis in die Gegenwart zum Gegenstand hat. Religionswissenschaftlich lassen sich Herrn Kings Arbeiten 2 breiten Themengebieten zuordnen. Erstens der intensiven Beschäftigung mit der klassischen hinduistischen und buddhistischen Philosophie, insbesondere der Entstehung der Schulen des Mahayana-Buddhismus, und zweitens mit der postmodernen, postkolonialen Kritik- und Methodendiskussion in unserem Fach. Wichtige Veröffentlichungen aus dem ersten Bereich sind beispielsweise Early Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism oder der Beitrag für die Fachzeitschrift Numen Is Buddha Nature Buddhist. Die neueren Arbeiten verbinden die Themen hinduistischer und buddhistischer Philosophiegeschichte mit aktuellen Theorie- und Methodendebatten. Richard Kings Orientalism and Religion gehört aus dem Jahr 1999, gehören hierher ebenso der 2007 gemeinsam mit John Hills herausgegebene Sammelband Religion and Violence in South Asia. Ein weiterer Aspekt der Arbeit von Richard King beschäftigt sich mit der Situation von Religion in der eigenen modernen westlichen Gesellschaft. Seine gemeinsam mit Jeremy Carrett verfasste kritische Studie von 2005, Selling Spirituality, The Silent Takeover of Religion, legt davon Zeugnis ab. Auf allen 3 Gebieten natürlich arbeitet Herr King auch heute noch, und ich denke, der nun folgende Vortrag wird das belegen. So,
Thank you.
Vielleicht noch wir gehen nachher noch gemeinsam weg, und zwar in ein Restaurant Himalaya im Postkamp 18. Und ich denke, wer von Ihnen mitkommen möchte, ist da herzlich eingeladen. Ich entscheide das jetzt so. Wer Lust hat, soll mitkommen.
Aber nicht zum Essen.
Nein, nicht zum Essen. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here and very grateful to be invited to talk today, as well as to teach a course this week. And I see some of my students are here. That's nice. I know they have to make you, but still, it's nice that you came. Firstly, just as being gracious to my hosts, I hope that that Germany does extremely well in the World Cup, with one exception. That's if you meet England on the way, but that may not happen because I'm not sure that we'll get out of our group. But anyway, today I want to talk about the shift in popularity of the term mysticism, its decline, and the rise in English, in Anglophone context, of the concept of spirituality. And I want to talk about that in terms of spending some time, most of the time, talking about how the concept of mysticism functioned in a colonial context. And then towards the end of the lecture, I'll talk about the decline of that concept and the rise of the concept of spirituality. So, in the introduction to his 1998 article on the body in Mark C. Taylor's edited volume, Critical Terms for Religious Studies, William Lafleur makes the following remarks. Quote, "The fact that the body has become a critical term for religious studies, whereas mysticism, for instance, has largely dropped out, can itself signal significant change in how we study religion. 20 or 30 years ago, the situation would have been reversed. Mysticism would have been a core term, and bodies, although mentioned in discussion of the theology of resurrection, would not have deserved a separate entry." Unquote. Now, Lafleur is, of course, only partially correct. Although generally given less significance than 30 or 40 years ago, the concept of mysticism has not, in fact, disappeared, but is rather in the process of being replaced by another category, the notion of spirituality. This can be seen, for instance, if we track the popularity of the two terms using Google's Ngram viewer, which is based on the data set of digitized works in the Google Books project. Here we have, in the digitized Google Books project database, a graph of the occurrences of the terms mysticism and spirituality in English language works. You can also do this for German and other languages. From 1850 to 2008. What we see when we look at that graph is a peak in references to mysticism in Anglophone works around 1930, with the term spiking again in the mid-1960s before becoming steadily less popular as the 20th century progresses. The term goes into decline. In contrast, the term spirituality appears less popular, but fairly steady in its usage from 1850 to 1970. But then there's a fairly sharp upswing in the use of the term in the latter half of the 20th century that inversely parallels the decline of the term mysticism during the same period. However, despite the relative decline in usage of mysticism and as a central category in contemporary work in the field of the study of religions, the term mystical and its associations remain deeply embedded in the intellectual history of the field, providing what Stephen Wasserstrom has called an influential mystocentrism at work within classic scholarship within the field. And we have here Gershom Scholem, Monsieur Eliade, Henry Corbin, and so on, part of the Iranos group. One can see this, for instance, in the continued emphasis that's placed upon some often poorly defined notion of experience as a core determining feature of human religiosity. The private experience tradition, as Russell McCutcheon has described it. In this sense, the mystical or the spiritual retains a preeminent place within the history of religions as an embedded and under-theorized category. Specialists in the history of specific religious traditions have largely left the study of spirituality in its contemporary forms to sociologists of religion. Suspicious, one suspects, of its faddish and fashionable status in the contemporary world. This, I'd suggest, is a mistake, such trends require the historian's perspective to place them in their appropriate long-term context. However, the significance of the ideas of mysticism and spirituality go way beyond the specific narrow confines of the academic study of religion. These terms, in fact, have formed important discourses related to the production of nationalist identities, especially in India and China in the modern period, and therefore through the entangled history of colonialism, also in the construction of Western identities. As Peter van der Veer has recently argued in his book, The Modern Spirit of Asia, what is needed, he argues, is, quote, a new perspective on spirituality that does not make it into a marginal form of resistance against secular modernity, but instead shows its centrality to the modern project, and a new perspective on secularity that shows the extent to which secularity is deeply involved with magic and religion. Unquote. Hello, C3PO. According to van der Veer, the narrow emphasis upon economic and political readings of history has caused modern commentators to miss the cultural or civilizational dimensions involved in the emergence of what we call modernity. And what he describes, borrowing a term from Ferdinand de Saussure's structural linguistics, as, quote, a syntagmatic chain of religion, magic, secularity, and spirituality, unquote. In other words, that these ideas are implicitly connected in their definitions. What this amounts to is a recognition that the diverse imperial and nationalist projects of secularization in the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe, North America, and Asia have all been bound up in complicated and sometimes contradictory ways with the emerging concepts of spirituality, religion, and magic, which thereby provide the conceptual platform or justification for contemporary constructions of the secular and the promotion and authorization of the secular as an historical project. I would like to spend a short time briefly examining the rise and fall of the concept of mysticism, which I take to have been a key discursive form in 20th century debates about religion and the secular, as a prelude to making some brief comments on the growing popularity in the current century of the concept of spirituality. As Michel de Certeau has argued in his book La Fable Mystique, the term mysticism is itself an offshoot of la mystique, and first seems to have come to the fore in early 17th century France. The invention of something called mysticism, in the sense of the imagining of a Christian mystical tradition, he argues, is a feature of the early modern period. Subsequently, as a result of colonial exploration and the European encounter with other cultures, the term mystical was exported and applied to non-European contexts. As I've attempted to show in my own published work, there's one of the books there, energized by the Romanticist fascination with all things Eastern, the term became particularly associated with tropes of the mysterious Orient and led to the construction of highly stereotypical representations of Asian traditions as mystical and otherworldly in nature. The term mysticism, of course, like its close relatives, religion and spirituality, is part of the normalized inventory of concepts that we derive from our European cultural heritage in the Western world. These concepts have been forged in an overwhelmingly Christian historical framework, inflected by the rise of secularist and humanist worldviews during the Enlightenment period. It's through the uncritical application of such concepts across cultures that European-derived conceptions of the world and of human history have been reproduced and universalized in the modern period. As Tomoko Masazawa, in her book The Invention of World Religions, has sought to demonstrate, the rise of the notion of a world religion in the early 20th century facilitated a shift in studies of religion from an earlier emphasis upon Christian universalism and superiority to a new language of pluralism and interfaith dialogue. This shift, she argues, is not what it appears to be. An account of the world that is narrated in terms of the category of world religions ends up playing a language game, she argues, that in its underlying logic and structure, if not necessarily in its outward appearance, is Eurocentric, or perhaps we might now say Euro-American, in its framing of human history and experience. The discourse of world religions functions so well in the 20th century liberal context precisely because it appeals to a variety of constituencies and agendas: Christian, non-Christian, and secular. And its success across these trends and groups has largely resided in its apparent nod to pluralism and multiculturalism. However, like the post-colonial proliferation of a variety of national histories to rival European accounts, the world religions template has had a tendency, as Dipesh Chakrabarty has suggested in a slightly different context, to reproduce Europe, and more specifically European Christianity, as the master template for all other histories. One aspect of this trend that Masazawa briefly touches upon in her book is the role that the emerging discourse of world religions played in justifying a variety of modernist and reformist projects across the world, driven essentially by their colonial encounter with the West. These modernizing trends, often led by indigenous elites, sought to reform native traditions in the light of their newly emerging global status as world religions. In the case of many Asian traditions, much of this conceptual work could be carried out by reference to discourses of mysticism and spirituality, which, fed by movements such as the Theosophical Society, popularized the idea of the transcendental unity or mystical common core to the various world religions, and also the idea of the specifically mystical nature of Eastern traditions. So one of the discourses, one of the ideas that became very popular in this late colonial period is the idea that mysticism perhaps is something that exists in all of the world religions and may be the point of contact, the point of similarity, the core that links and unites the different world religions. And this idea is sometimes expressed in the notion of the transcendental unity of religions, or in the idea of perennialism, which is the idea that certain teachings keep reoccurring across different cultures, and that this represents the basis for a kind of Pacific view of the different religions. Discerning the mystical essence of Asian traditions provided a neat way of packaging them, which could then be deployed in debates by modernist reformers and by critics of modernity in responding to the challenges of modernization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Both groups, critics of modernity and reformists, could appeal to an essentialized core said to be underlying outwardly complex and diverse beliefs and practices, and form the basis for making their various claims about tradition and the nature of its required reformulation. Debates about the mystical, then, cannot be divorced from the complex politics of the colonial encounter between the West and its others. I would like to suggest that we are currently in the midst of a new shift, one that, following the underlying logic discerned by Masazawa in the move from Christian universalism to a pluralism of world religions, is similarly represented within mainstream circles in a highly positive light, as an expression of greater individual freedom, but which functions nevertheless to undermine the resistance that long-standing cultural or, quote, religious traditions might have to power shifts that have and are taking place in the geopolitical order. An indicator of that shift is the demise in the world religions discourse, with its emphasis upon tradition, and a rising interest in the idea of de-traditionalized spirituality. This shift is occurring in both scholarly and popular culture, though the academic context has perhaps lagged behind wider cultural developments in this regard. However, to understand the context of this contemporary shift, we need to spend a little more time expanding upon my initial remarks about the category of mysticism. So very, very briefly, a brief history of the mystical. For much of its history, the Greek term mystikos, from which we ultimately derive words like mystical and la mystique, was used by European Christians to describe the mysteries of the liturgy. But it also became associated with allegorical forms of biblical hermeneutics, the mystical or spiritual meaning of Scripture, and the idea of a direct experience of the divine. In roughly the 6th century of the Common Era, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite coined the term mystical theology to denote what he saw as the highest form of reflection upon the divine, apophatic or negative theology. That is, the idea that the divine must necessarily transcend all human conceptualizations and limitations. Words must be left behind. In the modern period, these diverse, the other aspect to this is, of course, the association of mystical with the idea of the mystical body of the church. But in the modern period, these diverse strands became increasingly displaced by an emphasis upon something now called mysticism, a substantive noun denoting a specific cultural phenomenon said to exist within the various world religions, a strand emphasizing direct personal experience of the divine, to varying degrees unmediated by ecclesiastical ritual and dogma. Mysticism and the theological literature that became classified under its category became interpreted as an overwhelmingly experiential phenomena, thereby recasting understandings of the mystical according to a post-Enlightenment and increasingly psychologized conception of private experience. And a key figure in this is the figure of William James. By the beginning of the 20th century, emphasis shifted towards the use of the term as a substantive noun, mysticism. There's something out there called mysticism now, seen as denoting an identifiable and global phenomenon present in the various world religions. This is crucial, as mysticism as an academic category has been closely tied to the world religions paradigm. And I would argue its contemporary decline in popularity reflects the decline of that approach within the study of religions, and also a shift in social attitudes towards traditional modes of authority, and the rise of the entrepreneurial spiritual seeker seeking to develop their own customized approach to spiritual practice. I'll briefly mention two key South Asian figures during this turn of the century period who were instrumental in doing the work of modernizing, as they saw it, and universalizing Hinduism and Buddhism, and drawing them into this emerging world religions paradigm as the late 19th century drew to a close. They are Anagarika Dharmapala and Swami Vivekananda. Vivekananda, to your right, is founder of the Ramakrishna Mission, an organization devoted to the promotion of a contemporary form of the Hindu school of Advaita Vedanta, a tradition that promoted a thorough, non-dualistic philosophy, the idea that everything is Brahman, the divine, and placing particular emphasis upon the notion of the spirituality of Indian civilization as a cure to the nihilism and materialism of modern Western life. In Vivekananda's hands, prevailing Orientalist notions of India as otherworldly and mystical were embraced and praised as India's special gift to humanity. In so doing, Vivekananda became a focal point for the Indian people to unite under the banner of a universalistic and all-embracing Hinduism. Dharmapala, like Vivekananda, was a modernist reformer, though in this case with reference to the Theravada Buddhist traditions of Sri Lanka. Indeed, scholars such as H.L. Seneviratne have even gone so far as to argue, as he does in his 2000 book on the subject, that Dharmapala effectively founded a new religion, a kind of neo-Buddhism, strongly influenced by its encounter with Protestant missionary activities and the emergence of an indigenous, urban, middle-class elite in Sri Lanka. Dharmapala read Buddhist history through the lens of Western Orientalism, and in his very rejection of Protestantism, reproduced its emphasis upon scripture, social reform, a this-worldly work ethic, and a critique of the village superstitions that he saw as corrupting additions to the pure teachings of the Buddha. Of these two Asian figures, it was Vivekananda who was probably most influential in popularizing notions of Indian spirituality at the end of the 19th century. In India, as I say, he became a key figure in the development of what some scholars call Neo-Hinduism or Neo-Vedanta, that is a modernist and reformist trend within Hindu circles, heavily influenced by Orientalist and theosophical conceptions of India. It was Vivekananda who first popularized the idea of yoga as an Indian contribution to science, the science of supra-consciousness, and of yoga as the unifying symbol of the Indian nation. Indeed, for him, it was the task of his age to modernize a materialistic and depraved Europe with Hindu spirituality. This is a quote from Vivekananda. The salvation of Europe depends upon a rationalistic religion, an Advaita, non-duality, the oneness, the idea of the impersonal God, is the only religion that can have any hold on any intellectual people. This trope, this idea that Eastern philosophies were a spiritual antidote to a spiritually impoverished and materialistic West, went on to become the primary mode of engagement with Asian philosophical ideas throughout the 20th century. Exemplified not only by the beat poets and the hippies, but also by the proliferation of Eastern-influenced New Age movements, spiritualities, and alternative therapies, that all turned to the East for inspiration and authorization of their beliefs and practices. After Jack Kerouac's Dharma bombs in 1954, the very public explorations of Indian traditions by the Beatles, and the association with the expanded mind theories of Gregory Bateson, Aldous Huxley, Allen Ginsberg, and LSD guru Timothy Leary, Eastern philosophy not only became hip and cool, it also became coded as an important strand of Western counter-cultural discourse. Now, both figures, Vivekananda and Dharmapala, attended the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago, which itself marks a landmark event in the establishment of the world religions paradigm as the point of translation or point of intersection for non-Western civilizations and traditions in the late colonial, late 19th century period. One of the things that happens, just to summarize some of the trends that I think develop out of this, I want to pick out three. The first thing that happens is there is a process within popular culture of the homogenization of Asian traditions through this notion of spirituality and mysticism. Eastern spirituality comes to be seen in very vague terms as somehow promoting a kind of monism, a kind of everything is one. There is I don't know if you know the joke about the Buddha who goes to New York City and he goes up to a hot dog vendor and he says, "Make me one with everything." And then to continue that joke, he then gives the hot dog vendor a $10 bill and stands there, and the vendor says, "What are you waiting for?" And he says, "I'm waiting for my change." And the hot dog vendor says, "Don't you know change comes from within?" So this idea that Buddhism and all of these traditions basically are promoting the same idea of a kind of cosmic oneness start to gain popular traction. The second trend that happens is a form of psychologization, where yoga and meditation become seen as oriented and focused upon the individual and as being related to the cultivation of altered states of consciousness. Of course, these traditions historically have had lots of institutional, ritual, initiatory practices to them. And while there's a lot of material in yogic and Buddhist philosophical texts that we might describe as psychological, I think it's narrowing it down too much to treat them as psychological phenomena. And the third trend that I want to draw attention to is a trend of demythologization. Once you homogenize and psychologize a tradition, you are ignoring or abstracting that tradition from the institutional, political, ritual, cosmological, and apologetic dimensions of those traditions. Now, I've put the third of these three processes or trends, I've added a question mark after it. because the problem with describing it as demythologization is it implies that one is thereby abstracting these practices or philosophies and that they are then floating in a kind of non-culture, non-bound way. But of course they're not. What's happening is they're being recoded, mythologized, but according to a different set of ideas and agenda. It only becomes possible to represent yoga in this fashion because of the reconstruction of the social, economic, and political infrastructure of South Asia that was brought about by the complex processes of colonization and the modernization of India. The new forms of subjectivity that emerged in South Asia in the 19th and early 20th century under colonial occupation were highly influenced by European-derived notions such as religion, mysticism, and spirituality. Through the complex interactions brought about by European colonialism and indigenous Asian responses to them, yoga in India became nationalized, partially de-traditionalized, and its introspective dimensions increasingly emphasized. If we then fast forward to the early 21st century, with the rise of the prominence of the concept of spirituality rather than mysticism, we can see some of the consequences of an uncritical reading of the history of yoga in the development of highly individualized spiritualities of the self and the commodification and transformation of ancient yogic traditions and practices into secularized systems of therapy, physical exercise, and even mood enhancement in a late capitalist context. You stressed out, life's too busy, too fast-paced, do some yoga and de-stress. A third figure present at the World Parliament of Religions meeting in 1893 was Shakya Soen, who became the first Zen Buddhist to teach in the United States. Soen spoke about tolerance of other religions, the importance of non-violence, and an end to war. Despite such anti-war statements, Soen went on to serve as chaplain to the Japanese military during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5 and refused to renounce Japanese military expansionism, justifying such practices in terms of the missionary spread of Buddhist teachings and the upholding of humanity and civilization. Paul Karras, one of the organizers of the World Parliament and publisher for Open Court Press, asked Soen to contribute to the publication of translations of important Asian texts in the West. He declined the offer, but recommended his English-speaking student, Daisetsu Taitaro Suzuki, who was to become perhaps the most influential figure in the reception of Zen in the Western world as a result of his writings and collaborations with Karras and subsequent lecture tours of Europe and America. Suzuki came to the US and stayed with Karras, working on translations of the Tao Te Ching and other Asian philosophical classics. Ironically, during his time in the West, Suzuki would come to be heavily influenced by the work of William James in positing non-dualistic mystical experience as the basis and core of Zen Buddhist practice. On returning to Japan, Suzuki subsequently married a theosophist and Radcliffe graduate, Beatrice Erskine Lane, in 1911, and later in life became a theosophist himself. The theosophically inflected reading of Buddhism that Suzuki offered in his writings went on to become immensely popular in the West, influencing a whole generation of writers, poets, and artists, most notably the author Alan Watts, who has been a highly influential figure in the spread of Suzuki's brand of Zen in the Western world. Zen, in the writings of Suzuki and Watts, reflecting the post-Protestant influence of figures such as William James, becomes de-ritualized, this worldly, and in fact largely decontextualized, a repackaging of traditional Zen Buddhist teachings, emphasizing a spontaneous and unmediated experience of Satori awakening as the final goal of Zen practice. In 1951, Suzuki returned from his post as professor of Buddhist philosophy in Otani University in Japan to embark on a lecture tour of the US before returning to teach at Columbia University from 1952 to 1957. Suzuki's de-traditionalized and experiential version of Zen proved to be of enormous appeal to European and American audiences who were seeking an alternative not only to mainstream religious traditions and perspectives in the post-war period, but also his sanitized and pacific version of Japanese Buddhism functioned in the West as an important and attractive counter-narrative to the militaristic and aggressive images of the Japanese associated with the Second World War. In Japan, despite or perhaps because of its trans-historical and abstract nature, Suzuki's Zen also provided the intellectual basis for a revivified post-war nationalism, focusing on Zen as both the underlying essence of Buddhism as a whole, but also as the highest manifestation of the Japanese national character and spirit. So here we have two quotes from Suzuki. On the left here, we have one where Suzuki is making a claim that Zen represents the Japanese spirit. Today, 700 years after its blossoming, Zen has come in substance to be the basis for the Japanese character, thought, religious faith, and aesthetic tastes. With it, I believe in the future there can be constructed something new of worldwide significance, such is the mission of today's Japan. And then we have a quote on the right here where Zen is no longer being represented specifically as the Japanese spirit, but as a universal and global phenomenon. Quote, Zen professes itself to be the spirit of Buddhism, but in fact, it is the spirit of all religions and philosophies. When Zen is thoroughly understood, absolute peace of mind is attained, and a man lives as he ought to live. In the West, Suzuki's approach opened up the possibility of a decoupling of Zen from its specifically Buddhist and Japanese moorings. This has been crucial not only in the representation of Zen as being somehow beyond religion, as one particular form of a perennial universal mysticism that's said to exist at the core of the world religions. This idea, of course, was popularized in the West by figures such as René Guénon, Fritjof Schuon, and the Theosophical Society, and was further promoted by literary figures such as Aldous Huxley, whose works, The Perennial Philosophy in 1944 and The Doors of Perception in 1954, captured the public imagination. And his book, The Doors of Perception, itself a reference to William Blake, being the inspiration behind the name of Jim Morrison's cult band, The Doors. Okay. Yep. I can continue? Okay. Huxley, along with other influential literary and poetic figures such as Allen Ginsberg, Alan Watts, Timothy Leary, in the 50s and 60s, linked their exploration of LSD and mescaline-based mystical experiences to the spiritual philosophies of the East, which were generally characterized in a quasi-Vedantic fashion. That is, as an opening up of the mind, or cleansing the doors of perception, to use William Blake's phrase that Huxley is alluding to in the title of his work, to some kind of unmediated experience of the unity and divinity of existence. Such monistic accounts ride roughshod over the complexities and profound philosophical differences between these various Asian traditions. Moreover, although figures such as Huxley were keen to make clear that drug-induced mystical experiences offered only a brief flavour of the kinds of sustained experience of enlightenment sought in Asian traditions, the popular impact of such work, particularly as mediated through influential cultural figures such as John Lennon and Jim Morrison, was to reinforce a sense that mind-altering drugs such as LSD offered a potential fast track to Eastern forms of spiritual enlightenment. The impact of such homogenized characterizations over time has been that the Zen of Suzuki and Watts, like the various permutations of Hindu non-dualistic Vedanta, of Vivekananda, of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and of Deepak Chopra, could be poured into the melting pot of pick-and-mix spiritualities that characterizes what's been called the spiritual marketplace at the end of the 20th century, and then customized for the individual spiritual consumer. Thus, in the subsequent writings of many humanistic and transpersonal psychologists, beginning most notably with Carl Jung, but also including figures such as Abraham Maslow, Gordon Allport, and Ken Wilber, long-standing Asian traditions that have quite different metaphysical worldviews, practices, social and ritual forms, become homogenized and recoded according to a highly abstract psychological framework premised on contemporary Western notions of the individual self. Like its Indian counterpart, yoga, which has become increasingly presented in mainstream Western culture as a form of physical exercise and stress relief management, sometimes, though not always, with an exotic Eastern twist, Zen has become synonymous with serene or surreal experiences in general. Any of you who may have watched a popular comedy news show in the US called The Daily Show with Jon Stewart will know that there's always a segment towards the end of the show where he says, where he presents some bizarre or surreal media event that happened that week. And he says, and here it is, your moment of Zen. Zen has gone mainstream as a cultural signifier, but in a way that's disabused it of much of its claimed countercultural resonance. As a marketable commodity in the world of business, Zen connotes vague notions of pure experience, serenity, and an aura of peaceful contemplation for whatever product it's used to sell, in a way that remains emotionally satisfying but largely vacuous in its sheer lack of specificity. So here we have, I saw this in a health food shop in my hometown of Canterbury. It's Zen chocolate ice cream made with coconut milk. We have Zen breakfast cereals, Zen organic bars, we have Nirvana tanning lotion, and so on. We have cosmetic products such as Hydra Zen moisturizer from Lancome, and we have the Body Shop producing Zen nail varnish. Japanese multinational cosmetics company Shiseido introduced its own Zen fragrance with the following taglines: use your heart, free your mind, the fragrance of the spirit, and my favorite, harmony with nature, global empathy. Zen in these contexts denotes a relaxed state of mind, an exotic feel-good symbol useful for selling a consumer product or a certain mood, but little else. Here is a clinic in Edinburgh, in Scotland, a laser clinic called Zen Lifestyle, where you can have unwanted hair removed. Or again, I found this is a a pillow. You can buy one of those special pillows that are very expensive. Zen it, Swiss quality bedding. Zen in the art of putting you to sleep. Of course, independently of these highly banalized and commodified notions of Zen, more serious engagement with Buddhism and Asian traditions and practices, such as Hatha Yoga and ISKCON, popularly known as Hare Krishna, continue to develop, not only as a result of ongoing Asian migration to the West, but also through more serious Western engagement with Asian traditions, as they become indigenized features of American and European religious landscapes. Indeed, many of these movements, such as Robert Aitken's Hawaii-based Diamond Sangha and Bernard Glassman's Zen Peacemaker Order, play an important role in carrying forward social justice and countercultural orientations in their notions of contemporary engaged Buddhism. In popular culture, though, it tends to be the sanitized and decontextualized versions of these traditions that circulate and capture the public imagination. By the beginning of the 21st century, then, Asian philosophies and meditative practices have been increasingly seen as ways of reducing stress and coping with life in the fast-paced world of a globalizing and capitalist economy. At the same time, Eastern traditions continue to resonate with those interested in countercultural resistance to what they see as mainstream Western materialism and consumerism. The former trend is exemplified by the proliferation of spiritual management courses exploring Asian philosophical themes and meditation in the context of greater work efficiency and profit generation, and the spread of mindfulness-based stress reduction practices. The latter trend manifests itself in developments such as engaged Buddhism, which seek to challenge social injustice and the hold that corporate-driven consumerism and materialism have on much of our everyday lives. The distinction between these two characterizations is not as clear-cut as it might seem, but much of their cultural power resides in what they both share in common, namely a reliance upon a series of Orientalist assumptions and stereotypes about Asian spirituality and philosophy that have circulated in Western culture since at least the late 19th century. So to kind of pull this together, in the 20th century, the academic study of mysticism became a central feature in debates within the study of religion, reaching its peak in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Much of the academic literature displayed a concern, as William James had done, with questions of taxonomy. How many different types of mysticism are there? Building upon the impact of movements such as the Theosophical Society and Hindu reformists such as Vivekananda, some writers such as Aldous Huxley argued that mysticism represented a philosophia perennis, a perennial philosophy or common core running through the major world religions. The popularity of the category of mysticism was tied, I would argue, to late colonial imaginations of what distinguishes the East from the West, but was also used as a concept for what might potentially unite them, the transcendental unity of religions. And mysticism became linked thereby to the world religions paradigm and the search for underlying unities across these different world religions. However, as that has gone into decline, as interest in tradition has declined in modern Western societies, this discourse has also declined, but has been replaced by a new discourse, a discourse of spirituality and of the idea of individual expressions of one's spirituality that are not necessarily linked to the world religions or to traditions. One of the outcomes of this is a process of de-traditionalization and also banalization of these topics. Attempts by figures such as Suzuki, Watts, and Huxley to universalize mysticism and ground it in pure experience, opened the door for this move, for this detraditionalization, this privatization, and this banalization of terms such as Zen, mindfulness, etc. So what we see then, I'm arguing, is a decline in the popularity of the notion of mysticism, which I tracked in that graph, and the rise in the notion of spirituality, a term which is much more malleable, much more customizable, and is much more resonant with notions of a free, entrepreneurial, individual self, the individual self of late capitalism, where you can customize these practices and philosophies to your own specific needs. It's also linked to a phenomenon that sociologists have got very excited about in the field of sociology of religion, which is the development of the idea that one can be spiritual but not religious. That is, that there is an aspect, an understanding that is not a purely materialistic view of the world, but which does not need or feel the need to conform or belong to a specific religious tradition. The problem with detraditionalization and the freedom to self-development, I would argue, is that it presents itself as a discourse of free-floating, detraditionalized spirituality, but it is not culturally neutral, and it is not as disembedded as it appears. And what we are seeing is the recoding of ancient beliefs, practices, and philosophies according to prevailing Western psychological and late capitalist notions of the human self. Thank you very much.
The floor is open for questions.
If I take the names you quoted, Huxley, Watts, Jung, I was missing a comment on the groups around them. For example, CIS, the California Institute of Studies, the Esselen movement, the earnest people. Isn't the work of these people that we could add the Amsterdam research in empiricism and Hermeticism, isn't that a sort of antidote to your development you were showing us?
Could you elaborate on what you think that antidote is?
The interesting thing in your talk to me was that you put it in perspective declining, changing. I was missing the greater picture where there was another development, like in San Francisco, the CIS work is something quite different from what you showed us. It's taking seriously the traditions. In the institute before, it was a sort of Asian institute to bring the traditions, not the declining factors, to America. And then the Esselen work goes back to Huxley and Watts.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you take Jung and Uranos and Maggiore, for an enormous number of years, there was a medium of East and West in respect of the tradition. I was missing that.
The CIS, the Integral Studies Centre, that, if I understand that correctly, is linked to Ken Wilber's work. Is that right?
I wouldn't be used for that.
Okay, because I have a vague familiarity with CIS, perhaps less than you. So in that sense,
If you take Richard Harness, that's not Wilber. Standing off is not Wilber.
I think that there is a lot out there that is counter to this trend. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to pull out what I think is a culturally dominant trend. But that doesn't mean that I think always in these contexts there are always points of resistance to these. So I thank you for pointing that out.
You talk about the decline in popularity of mysticism. Is it correct that the last 20 to 30 years, has seen a rise of a revival of the tradition of Sufism, of the Bhakti movement in India, or various mystical traditions in terms of publications, in terms of texts. And there's a big market now. Now, would you call all these people buying these books and reading them, I hope so, being just spiritual, or are they inclined to be called mystics or mystic lovers?
No, I think that's a good point, actually. I think that one area where the category of mysticism is perhaps not declining to the same degree is precisely in Sufism and Sufi studies. I agree. I think that there is still a lot of work going on in that. But generally, I'm talking generally about, the tracked decline in published works referring to mysticism. We can see it tracked in Anglophone writing, but also its decline, as in William Lafleur's comment, its rapid decline in the study of religion, certainly in the Anglophone world. So, for instance, when I became a PhD student, mysticism was one of the topics that you studied. It was one of the key issues. And I actually wanted to do a PhD on mysticism, but found it a very difficult topic to land on. And luckily for me, I chose instead to specialize on Hindu and Buddhist philosophy because you don't get jobs in mysticism. You get them for being specialists, and so that was a good choice by me, I think, career-wise. But the difference now is that, at least in my experience, reflects what Lafleur says, in that there's much less published about mysticism now, and there are less courses taught. Right? I like to teach a course on it, but it's not the hot topic that it was, say, in 1980, 1990. In my experience.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I think you made some really important points, but on some points I have to admit that I disagree, or at least I think I disagree. So I have problems like with the notions of transformation of traditions and what you call recoding of ancient beliefs, at least in part, like concerning the yoga tradition, the so-called yoga tradition. Like, I have the feeling that it's not I wouldn't call it a transformation of tradition. I would rather say it's a total reinvention of a new tradition. So when you look before Vivekananda and before you are into this started studying the Yoga Sutras in India, there was, at least as far as I know, like virtually non-existing tradition left which practiced or even studied the Yoga Sutras. So until Vivekananda popularized it through Raja Yoga. And also like the body yoga, like, which is so popular nowadays. I think it's not a transformation of ancient yoga practice, because like what is popularized nowadays is something which evolved in India like at the beginning, like as I understood it, at the beginning of the 20th century due to the influence mainly of indigenous and also Western systems of bodily culture. So I think what we have now, like this spread in modern yoga nowadays, is not like, I don't understand it as a transformation of a tradition, because like the bodily yoga we have nowadays has pretty much nothing to do with what you find in the Hatha yoga text and so on. Of course, like in the years they started referring to the text, but I think it's I wouldn't call it transformation. I would call it something totally new, which came out of Western and Indian influences coming together.
Thank you. That's a really interesting point, and I think that I think that that's a decision that we as scholars make about how we represent the phenomenon. That is, do we approach them as brand new inventions of traditions, or do we approach them with, if you like, the historian's longue durée, the long view of these? And I think that a lot of the sociological literature on those movements does, because of the nature of that subject, focus upon the contemporaneity of it, its newness. But of course, many of those traditions which we can view as new developments, and I think you're right, I mean, lots of the bodily aspects of contemporary postural yoga, there's been much work that showed that, you know, some of the positions and poses and so on were taken from Indian wrestling traditions and so on. So, you know, it's a complicated situation. But those movements, insofar as they make authority claims that they represent that tradition, that this is what Patanjali is talking about in the Yoga Sutras, or this relates back to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and so on. Insofar as they make that authority claim, they are claiming not to be new. They are claiming to be authentic and linked to the classical. And that needs to be investigated and interrogated. And from my point of view, not as a sociologist, but as a historian of ideas, I approach everything in terms of the history of where it came from. So I would say, I don't want to disagree with you, but I want to say that it's a function of how we as scholars decide to approach the phenomenon that we're looking at.
Okay. Some more questions? Well then, I would add something, because I want to know, is mysticism and spirituality the same in Germany as in England, in France, or in the US?
Now,
or is it something linked to specific historical conditions which might be different in these countries? I will come to this later. I don't think I'm in a position to make a comment on that. In fact, I'd be very interested to know what people think about that, because of course this is really tracking an Anglophone discourse. Yeah. So how that unfolds and unpacks in other contexts would itself be an interesting position. I don't know if you have any views on that. Yeah. Well, I have some views from our history in Germany. Take the Nazi times and what they made out of this mysticism. This was quite a big issue for SS officers. They said we inherit this Eastern mysticism, and they were proud of it. And this is what you meant with this counterculture. Mm-hmm. This was in Germany, especially in the 1930s, and discourse where especially right-winged were on the top. They said, we are counterculture. We are against this capitalism coming from America. We must go back to our roots, and these are mystic roots from the East, mm-hmm. inherited from the old Aryans coming from the,
yes.
I don't know where. But this was really an issue, and it's interesting to see that that in the 1950s or 60s, this was no discourse at all. Of course, this changed in Germany with the New Age movement coming in, but this was not the old elites interested in these issues in the 1930s or 40s. And they heavily influenced Hitler and his gang, and they said, yeah, we must do something to connect us back with India, and then they supported Subhrant Bose. I don't know if you know him.
No.
He came to Berlin and was a go back and revolutionize British India. This were all connected with our science, and no one wants to talk about it. So we have a really different kind of mysticism.
Yes.
And the question is, can you say that's the mysticism of the West constructing the East? Because, of course, in Germany they constructed something out of it, but it was different from what was going on in England or in America.
Yes, and I think there's an element of folk mysticism there, of folk mysticism going on in that process. But I think that's a really good example, thank you for that, of the points I was wanting to make earlier, which is that we tend to approach categories like mysticism and spirituality and think of them as quaint and unimportant to big questions such as modernity, but actually they have been wrapped up with political questions and constructions of national identity for a long time. Thank you.
Okay. No more questions?
Considering your mainstream focus in your talk, trivialization, let's put it this way, how do you, as a historian, explain the scholar development of Amsterdam and Exeter? One would think that esoteric research should disappear somehow. Instead, we get tenure in Amsterdam and in Exeter and in other places. Is there for you the historical explanation? How could that happen?
In the case of the esoteric, that's a fascinating one for me, but it's one that I not worked on, and also the particularities of the Dutch context for that as well is interesting. I'm not sure I'm really in a position to talk about that, but I'd be very interested to learn about it because there are points of similarity and connection here, but of course the point at which I'm approaching, because there's a point at which the category of mysticism does fold into that whole esoteric idea within European civilization. But my point of intersection into it, because of what I work on, is the mystic East. It's the Hindu Buddhist tradition. So I don't really feel able to comment on that, but I'd be very interested to hear thoughts on it about why that continues to be seen as an important area, as I think it should, but the question is why. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I think, who knows the way to the Himalaya?